Support for American Masters is made possible in part by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television, and by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts. Additional funding for American Masters is provided by Rosalind P. Walter, Jack Rudin, the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation, the Andre and Elizabeth Cortez Foundation, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
When you look at Norman Rockwell, it's almost like being Gulliver going to another planet and looking at a kind of miniature fantasy world.
He kind of created a mythical, wonderful land of childhood innocence and exuberance.
Rockwell, better than any other American artist in history, painted the American dreams. Better than anyone.
Welcome to Norman's Place. Come in and join me, and come in around to your right. Join us here in front of Main Street, in front of the world of Norman Rockwell.
I almost by accident was in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and went to see the Norman Rockwell Museum. In a way, I was actually more interested in seeing the Robert Stern building than the holdings, but I was there. And I walked in, and it was for me like discovering a whole new planet. I had to confess that these pictures were riveting.
I really believe that the first memories of Rockwell in my life were almost subliminal. They were just a part of what it was like to grow up in America. He was already becoming part of the American fabric.
This is his Main Street. This is his bank. The butcher shop where he buys his food.
We talk about things in terms of Norman Rockwell. Well, this is no Norman Rockwell. You know, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, Toto.
I suppose he's about as much apple pie as anybody in this country, Mr. Norman Rockwell.
I don't think there's any other artist in the world whose work is seen within his own society with the same continuous affection. You go to him like somebody going to a fond and friendly and utterly benign uncle.
Before we go any further, I do want to thank you on behalf of this country for all the wonderful, wonderful paintings you have furnished us with.
Tell me, offhand, how many covers did you do for the Saturday Evening Post?
Well, I never counted them, but some people have counted. They count up to 360 odd.
He was a myth maker. He made myths that people who were not concerned with art as such could believe in.
He captured us in a blink of his artistic eye. He just sort of captured the way we were and the way we should always be.
They're like slides through which dreams are projected.
The story of my life, Rockwell once said, is really the story of my pictures and how I made them. Because in one way or another, everything I have ever seen or done has gone into my pictures.
My brother said recently when he was interviewed about his own work and somebody tried to put on him something about simple Norman Rockwell, he just said he's a lot more complicated. He was a lot more complicated than that.
Our view of Rockwell is characterized by a great longing for simplicity. And the mistake we make about Rockwell is to say that X defines this man.
The work may tell the story of the man, but not as we expect. Rockwell became a legend with images of the familiar and everyday. Reassuring images that seem to say little of change or struggle. In fact, Rockwell's life held much of both. And in the end, he painted that story too. He went beyond our expectations.
You would think that he probably grew up on a farm somewhere in the Midwest, but he didn't. He grew up in New York City, born there.
I was born on 103rd Street and Amsterdam Avenue, in New York. But I got out pretty quick.
He was a New York City boy. He said that when he was 6 years old, he used to go up and sit on the roof of the boarding house they lived in and watch the Irish and the German gangs fight it out with bicycle chains. They did go out to the country in the summers for vacations, and I think he probably developed some idyllic feeling about that, maybe, I don't know. Then they moved out to Mamaroneck.
The family lived in a succession of boarding houses. Rockwell's father worked as an office manager. His mother was often ill. Rockwell would later write of himself as a boy, "I didn't think too much of myself. A lump, a long, skinny nothing, a bean pole without the beans. All I had was my ability to draw."
I just guess from what he's said to me and what I read in his own autobiography that he spent a fairly lonely childhood and that he did not have a close relationship with his parents, and that his peer world was the important world to him. And the fact that he was not a good athlete and that he did not shine as a scholar, but that he always drew, and he garnered the admiration of his peers through his drawing.
Were you a university man yourself?
I went to 2 years of Mamaroneck High School.
You did?
Yeah.
2 years of Mamaroneck High School?
I can give you the chair. It's too long.
Really? What was the cheer?
Oh, it's too long. I thought I heard my grandmother say the MHS won a game today with a Rebo and a Ribo and a Rebo, Ribo, rum. Boom, get a rat trap bigger than the cat trap, sis, boom, bar. Mamaroneck High School, rah, rah, rah.
That's great. That's delightful. His ninth grade principal called him in at the end of the year and said, "Rockwell, you got to get serious. This thing of art school, you got to make up your mind. Art school or high school," knowing that he would decide high school. And my father said, "Fine, I'll go to art school."
He was always aimed at illustration. His father apparently used to read Dickens and used to copy illustrations out of magazines. Illustration was part of the excitement of his own growing up.
It was the one visual medium that everybody was tuned into. There was no television. Illustration was the visual sort of vehicle in which these stories were brought to life. And so it was, as they call it, the golden age of illustration.
Rockwell enters Art Students League not to learn how to be a great painter in the manner of the Ashcan School. He goes straight to the illustrator classes.
My father went to art school, and then by the time he was 16, he started professionally illustrating.
Not only was he talented, but he had the ability to knock this stuff out very early. And he was art editor of Boy's Life at the age of 19. Think of it.
When he was 22, he took some things down to the Saturday Evening Post, which to him and which to most other people was the peak of illustration.
He tells a wonderful story of his own awkwardness, having a special box built for himself to carry his work down to show it to the editors of the Post. And it looked like some kind of funeral contraption, and going in and showing his work and being very surprised when they took it. this would be sort of like getting an Oscar the first time you made a movie.
Norman, you've been identified with the Saturday Evening Post for many, many years. When did you do your first cover for them?
Well, Ed, this happens to be the original of the first cover I did. I don't know whether it was before you were born or not. It was in
No, not quite.
1916. And this is the original of it. In those days, we used only red and black.
High-fidelity, mass, rapid colour printing is what made him and the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's Ad Look and all the rest of them possible. He rises just at the moment that America still wants painted, drawn, in other words, made effigies of daily life rather than simply photographed ones.
He did have certain subjects that he loved. He loved kids. I think it was a great deal of autobiographical stuff in dealing with kids all the time.
You don't get a sense when you read Norman Rockwell's autobiography that he had a kind of idyllic barefoot boy with cheek of tan upbringing. And so for many years, for maybe the first 15 years of his career, he kind of created a mythical, wonderful land of mischievous boys and dogs, usually that had one brown eye. And is that fake or is it real? In some emotional way, Rockwell paints an emotional truth, and that is he's a city boy from New York who clearly did not like that place. And I think what he didn't like about it was a kind of sense of emotional violence that robbed him of a childhood.
Rockwell remembered one image of the city that overshadowed all others. As a child, he saw a drunken woman beating a man with an umbrella.
He sees her screaming as she stumbles through a lot. All of Rockwell's art until the 1960s is running away from whatever it is he saw in that vacant lot.
Rockwell said, "Against that image of the city, I set the country. The view of life I communicate in my pictures excludes the sordid and the ugly. I paint life as I would like it to be."
In a sense, he was the dream of what we wanted to be rather than the reality. Nobody of any real sophistication ever thought that we were, in fact, what Norman Rockwell was portraying. But virtually everybody thought it would be nice if we were what Norman Rockwell was portraying.
Rockwell seemed to be everywhere, from magazine covers to Boy Scout calendars to advertisements. Everybody knew there was magic in Rockwell's brush.
People followed illustrators the way they subsequently followed movie stars, and Norman Rockwell became the sort of superstar, you know, the Clark Gable, great performer in that arena.
Rockwell lived in the world of his work, among other commercial artists, in New Rochelle, a New York suburb where many successful illustrators had settled. That was where Rockwell met Irene O'Connor.
My mother was his second wife. His first wife was a school teacher who he claimed, whether this is true or not, that in the enthusiasm of having been picked by the Post in 1922, he went back and invited this pretty school teacher who was living in the same boarding house as he lived in New Rochelle, asked her to marry him. He later years described it as not a terribly close marriage, and that both of them lived a fairly 20s free and easy lifestyle in the suburbia of New Rochelle and having affairs with other people.
Rockwell traveled widely during the 1920s without Irene. He wandered the world, North Africa, Central America, and Europe. In his early work, Rockwell often explored the dreams of youth.
The first painting I purchased was Daniel Boone. It was probably the first painting I ever purchased in my life. A writer trying to find his next story. Here's a superimposition of a plainsman or a Daniel Boone character, you know, kind of like in smoke, just over the kid's head as he's imagining the story he's trying to tell. Conjuring an image, and then that image is going to find its way to the paper.
At the end of the 1920s, Rockwell's marriage with Irene ended.
He got divorced and he thought, oh, I'm going to live the life of the bachelor. And sometime soon after, he met this cute Mary Barstow, who was just a year out of college, 14 years younger than him. And I think a week later got engaged. And I do remember that my father was always mildly chagrined that his hometown newspaper, the New York Times, put when they got married, Mary Barstow, California socialite marries artist.
The new decade, the 1930s, brought stability at home, and soon a family. Jarvis, Tom, and Peter. But at work, Rockwell was still restless.
He was working for a predictable market and knew what the public wanted. But he also had endless aching doubts about his own persona as an artist.
One of the hard things to realize is that Norman Rockwell never painted pictures to be seen. You know, when you think about artists, you think about them painting pictures they're going to hang on the wall, hang in a museum, or hang somewhere. Norman Rockwell was selling reproduction rights. That's what he was doing. They were painted for a camera. And they were painted for color separations, and they were painted for high-speed printing presses.
At a creative stalemate, Rockwell took off again for Europe, settling with his family in Paris. Mary wrote home that, after 2 years of struggling, Norman knows what he wants to do, which is experiment with all sorts of things, to become an artistic artist instead of a commercial one.
Throughout Rockwell's career, he has these wild engagements with the modernist spirit. He tells about going to Paris, falling madly in love with dynamic symmetry and painting a cover and bringing it home and showing it to Lorimer, the long-term editor of the Post. And Lorimer saying, now, no more of that, Norman, no more of that.
He had the ambitions of transcending the traditions of popular illustration. I mean, I guess it's almost the equivalent of a crackerjack journalist who longs to be a writer of the great American novel, but has to grind out his copy every week and feels as though he's been defeated.
He was very intense about his work and could get very upset. And then he had this perfectionism. As I can remember my mother saying, Norman, for goodness sake, it's done, stop it. That detail isn't going to make any difference. He'd say, no, I got to get just this little detail right.
Rockwell's work in the 1930s revealed little of either his own crisis or the nation's.
I was selling the Saturday Evening Post from door to door. Now, I was living in a town in North Jersey, down on the Passaic River. The Depression had really hit hard there. People came to the door, men in undershirts, women who were breathing beer fumes. You know, people who hadn't worked in years. And looking at this Norman Rockwell cover on the Saturday Evening Post, you want to buy a Saturday? They'd say, don't you have true story? Don't we have true detective? You know, they wanted to read about vice and adultery and see pictures of mutilated bodies at the morgue. And I'd hold this thing up with this charming, idealized America that Rockwell was drawing. And, oh, it was hard work. After I grew up and thought about this, I realized what he was doing. Yeah, in a way it was like propaganda, except it was nice propaganda.
He was able to present in America in quite strong popular images, not rah-rah tub-thumping ones, the ones that came that got under your skin, of certain ideas of American mutuality, American idealism, American virtue above all. It harks back to an original Puritan promise, the idea that America ought to be the community within the city on the hill. It's an America that never completely existed, but which is always surging up in American dreams.
If ever Rockwell's vision of America met the real one, it was in Arlington, Vermont, where Rockwell moved at the end of the 1930s.
He came to Arlington at a time in his life when he was looking for a new way, maybe some new energy and new scenery. He came originally to buy a vacation home for his family, and apparently he just fell in love with the beauty, the serenity, the peacefulness, the simple way of life that a small Vermont community would offer a person.
Hi, come on in. Welcome to the gallery. I'd like to tell you that Norman Rockwell lived here in town for 14 years. We knew him as a friend, as a neighbor, not so much as a famous artist. He used over 200 people in town as models, myself included.
The first time I met Norman was at a basketball game in the Arlington High School gym. We had begun the third quarter, and I suddenly wanted a Coke. So when I turned to my father and said, "Dad, I want a Coke," he said to me, "They only serve Cokes during the half." And this man said to me, "Here, have my Coke." And my parents turned around and thanked Norman and introduced me to Norman. And he looked at me and he said, "How would you like to pose for me?" I don't think that I knew that he was famous. In our town at that time, there were several artists who did post covers. And it was just kind of normal living.
I remember my father getting phone calls from Norman, sometimes at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they would go over there and help and discuss. My father is Mead Schaefer. He also did covers and illustrated for the Saturday Evening Post. They were almost like brothers. They would talk over their work, which was very consuming. All four of them, Norman, my father, John Atherton, and George Hughes. They lived and breathed their work.
He was a workaholic. He worked 7 days a week. One of the things I remember is little family fights because he would try to go out to work on Christmas Day afternoon, and my mother would say, "You don't work on Thanksgiving and Christmas. You may work 7 days a week, but he would somehow or other figure out a way to sneak out there and work."
And there seems to be an emotional deepening of his work in Arlington. Perhaps it was the fact that he was living in a community where the war touched individuals so strongly. And certainly it's the heart of the Willie Gillis series, which I think is one of the most interesting documents of the Second World War ever produced.
He created a character, Willie Gillis, and took it through something like 9 or 11 covers. And Willie Gillis is never shooting a gun and never firing.
Terrible things don't happen to Willie, but the ordinary adventures of life happen at the same time that he's connected to his hometown. Rather than dealing with great events and great people, this is not the movie tone news. This is what happens to your son, your brother, your boyfriend when he goes off in the service. Poor little Willie Gillis was a buck private. Norman, he envisioned a very glamorous woman being his girlfriend, and he chose me. One time, he had a bed all made up, and I was there in curlers, which I didn't like at the time, but I was supposed to be dreaming of Willie Gillis. His pictures were all over the bed, and they were sort of looking down on me. At the foot of the bed, there was an envelope. I had just received a letter from him. Lee Schaefer, my whole
address on the thing. When that got published, I received mail from all over the world, from servicemen. My mother wasn't exactly happy, but it was great.
He did a great deal of patriotic painting in World War II, but he only did one painting of people fighting. He didn't try to pretend that wasn't going on. It was a conscious act in his painting, and also as part of his wanting to be loved. I mean, I don't think it went so far that it falsified things in his painting, but he really did like to be liked.
I remember a February, and I remember sitting in a big chair, and the fire was raging in the fireplace because it was very cold that night. And Norman had received some mail, not a criticism exactly to the painting, but somebody noticed something that was not technically perfect, just some little thing. But he was rather upset about it. I remember my father saying, "What has that got to do with painting? Oh, just forget it, you know." And he said, "I don't want to forget it. I want to become a household name." Well, with that, my father was, "What do you want that for?" And I remember John Atherton was really, they really were rather upset with him. I turned around to all of them, and I took my glass and I clinked it to his, and I said, "Go for it." And he did.
Norman Rockwell's creation of the Four Freedoms was a project that he very much wanted to do as a consequence of the United States being involved in World War II. He was 43 at the time, too old to serve. So he did work with an idea, and that was the fact that President Roosevelt at the time had made a presentation to Congress. In future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon four essential freedoms.
First is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. Second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world.
He did have this sort of thing of the big painting. He wanted to do something for the war.
The third is freedom from want, which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants. Fourth is freedom from fear.
You hear the story of Rockwell waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning at the beginning of World War II, just obsessed by Franklin Roosevelt's concept of the Four Freedoms, and can't get back to sleep, and is literally driven to create something to match the eloquence of Franklin Roosevelt's words.
World War II was a real turning point in Norman Rockwell's career. He suddenly got caught up in the war, and it became personal. It was no longer the subject of his work, simply, how do I please my client? It was much more, what is this really about, and how do I make a contribution to it?
I remember his going down to Washington and trying to get the war bond drive to buy them, to sell war bonds. And my father went with him, and they were very dejected, and they said it didn't go. And Mary Rockwell was the one that spoke up, well, why don't you take them into the Saturday Evening Post and see what they had to say about it? And it was a go.
High in the hills of Vermont, the key of the greatest financial undertaking in the history of the world.
After the Saturday Evening Post bought the Four Freedoms, the government leapt on the bandwagon and used the paintings for the war effort.
Neighbors come to the home of Norman Rockwell to pose for posters for the second war bond drive. This one, Freedom from Want. first of America's basic four freedoms.
The Four Freedoms are an interesting exercise in peace. This is maybe the first expression of Norman Rockwell's social conscience coming to the surface. Freedom from fear. And this picture seems to me to be a fervent prayer that war never touches these children.
I actually used a Rockwell in a movie when I made Empire of the Sun. I used a picture of two parents tucking their child into bed at night.
Go to sleep. It's an awkward spot.
I reenacted that picture with my actors when they put Jim to bed in the first act of Empire of the Sun. And Jim later on takes that Rockwell, the picture of that Rockwell from Life magazine, cut out in his little suitcase when he is taken off into a Japanese prisoner of war camp. That painting almost became a betrayal of what, through art and radio and literature, he was taught to believe that his parents would always be there for him. And in this case, they weren't, and they couldn't be.
Norman, do you have any idea of how many copies have been made of those paintings?
I don't really know. I know it runs into millions and millions. Freedom from Want would have to be the most famous painting that Rockwell ever did. What you're getting is a kind of virtuous abundance. There is the desire for continuity, which is expressed in the generations of the family. The absence of interior decoration, plainness of the light, the way it falls. What Rockwell is talking about in this picture is a direct link which has never been eroded back to the original Puritans. The Puritans come to America not in the expectation of getting hugely rich, but of getting free. There's very little drama in the picture. Everything is plain, everything is explicit, everything is candid, and that's because it's all under the eye of the Lord and Norman Rockwell.
I really get choked up sometimes looking at some of his work, especially these Four Freedoms. They're absolutely marvelous.
Perception is reality for whoever wants to look through a certain lens. And if you want to look through someone else's lens, like Rockwell's, the important thing is that it did become reality for a lot of people.
The Four Freedoms were poignant images, and they did focus our attention on what we valued or believed we valued in those terrible early 40s.
He finished the Four Freedoms and then soon after succeeded in burning up his own studio by knocking out a pipe onto the cushion. Maybe it was a recognition of the self-destruction that is in any artist that especially comes up after you've done something particularly hard and particularly long.
In public, Rockwell treated the event as a humorous tale of domestic adventure. The fire consumed props and costumes that had been the foundation of Rockwell's work.
When that happened, he lost a collection of a lifetime, which in a way had tethered him to kind of costume pieces and turned him more in the direction of documentary scenes that dealt with the world around him and the here and now. It's just Norman Rockwell coming to grips with what his world looks like.
Rockwell did a series for the Post, visiting places in the everyday life of America, from a small-town newspaper to a country doctor's office. His paintings went out on location. The Saturday Evening Post was under new leadership. The editors pushed Rockwell to explore a more modern style.
When I was a kid in Australia, one saw illustrations by Rockwell because one saw the Saturday Evening Post. I don't remember having any doubt when I saw Rockwell's depictions of middle-class, small-town life in America that that was what America was really, really like.
They were portraitures of America and Americans without cynicism. I was raised in the late 40s and early 50s, you know, at a time when I was feeling safe and comfortable and protected. I had bad news censored by my parents, and the media in those days, you know, wasn't as outspoken to show every, you know, flaw and disaster and tragedy as they seem to rush to almost exploit today. So I grew up in a very innocent world. I look back at these paintings as America the way it could have been, the way someday it may again be, but certainly the way it was right after the Second World War.
And that was that time. It was about heroes. It was about nice people. It was about good things. There was this sort of idealism. I mean, we believed that we were as good as we told ourselves. and he told us we were good. Certainly, the James Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life, was Rockwell. You know, this guy who has an angel, a benevolent angel who follows him, has all these friends. He's holding his little daughter, and suddenly turn it into a Rockwell painting, and you can see exactly how it would look. It's Rockwell.
There's really only one virtue in Rockwell, and that's tolerance. There's the famous painting that is always used by people who advocate the Rockwell as a kind of conservative icon. It's called Saying Grace. And the general presumption, of course, that this is Rockwell advocating family values and obedience to authority and traditional religion and public prayer. In fact, what the painting is about is that all the people around them are tolerating this. That's the real subject, is the audience. And what Rockwell is telling us is that, okay, let them go ahead and do that. That's the whole moral of everything that you see in Rockwell. It's always the idea of people approving of other people.
For me, many of his paintings were really about citizenship. Citizenship in the nation and citizenship in the home.
The minute you saw a Norman Rockwell painting, you felt good. He was a salesman. He could sell things because he had this dream. The advertising world, when I first came into the business, was the world of Norman Rockwell. People only smiled.
I connect to the fact that every painting, you know, is a story that can be told again and again, and you never get tired of hearing the story, and you never get tired of the interpretation always being pretty much the same. The same way a movie, if it's not an esoteric, you know, a movie, or if it's not too cerebral, a movie is a movie. It tells one story, and that story can repeat as many times as you see it. And Rockwell is filmmaking in paint. His paintings were full of dialogue, full of monologue. It was just one look would just speak volumes.
The mature work process for Norman Rockwell is kind of complicated. First, he gets the idea. Then he starts making little bitty sketches of what the idea might be like.
And then I used to take them in those days down to Philadelphia. And then generally I act them out more than to show them a sketch. They okay it, and then I go back to the studio.
He has an assistant who then will photograph the model in the position that he wants. And if he can do it, he'll photograph the model with the background he wants as well.
He worked almost exclusively from life until about 1937. And then he began to go for photography in a big way. Not because it made it easier or cheaper, but because it enabled him to do things he couldn't do without. The camera made it possible for him to catch action. The camera made it possible for him to look down on a scene or to look up at something. It expanded his options enormously.
I use photographs a great deal. Because you have a person doing something, you can take 50 pictures of them, and then you pick one that expresses the idea best.
One of the final steps is then to project the photograph onto a large sheet of canvas and to quite literally trace it.
Then he would produce a full charcoal sketch, which was really a detailed, careful drawing of what the cover would be. It was a process of painting by which you went very carefully, step by step, through building up to the final act of painting. But then in the final act of painting, there would come moments when things didn't work out right, and he would make changes. He would even sometimes reject and start over again. There was one, The Facts of Life, which, if I remember rightly, he spent 11 months doing it, repainted it 3 times, had to take out bank loans because he just stopped earning money for 11 months while he tried to get this painting right. Every time he sent a picture down to the post, he would be in a state of jitters that they might reject it. When by the time I was conscious of anything of this, he was so successful that the idea that they would reject something is sort of nonsensical, but he was petrified.
Then I deliver, and then I had an old model who used to say to me, did you get the check? You see? And I say, yeah, I got the check. That's the thing, my boy, get the check. You see? Then I get paid for it, and then I have to think up another one.
He was about pleasing the boss. If the boss wanted to be charmed and amused, that's what he did, and that's usually what the Post was looking for.
He used the family a lot. It wasn't until I became much older that I realized that ideas came from the family. He did that diving board cover the summer after I went through a whole thing of getting up my nerve to jump out of the window of the covered bridge. That was a sort of a sign of being a big boy, that you had the nerve to jump into the river from the window of the covered bridge. They ran this board from the top of the balcony railing over to, they took Pop's easel and wound it up the top and put the board across the top and then sort of tied it and then said, crawl out there and look frightened. I was frightened before I crawled out there, let alone how I felt once I got out there.
I have read in my adult life, it was quite a surprise, that he said that I was his favorite child model, that he could get me to do things with my face that just delighted him. Generally, he had a little sketch, and he'd tell me the story about that sketch. For example, the little girl with the black eye. Well, he really set that one up well. He said, look, you're victorious in this picture. You're the little girl who beat the boys. And that was really beyond my imagination, but he said, you're going to grin. Just think about what it's going to feel like to be the victor. And so when I sat down to do it, he literally got down on the floor, started pounding the floor with his hands and kept saying, come on, come on, come on, I want to smile. And he just started cheering me on. And pretty soon I was just able to let go, and out came that marvelous grin.
Rockwell was an actor, I think. I think Rockwell was kind of a pretty good performer himself. He liked his face. You know, he enjoyed that he looked a lot like the subjects he was painting. He didn't look like a California surfer. God knows what he would have painted had he looked like that. He looked just like that kind of Eastern Midwestern face, that his vision of America and Americans. And I think he painted him, that's why he so often put himself in his own pictures.
He began to really focus on what life was in America. And this seemed to be a happy time in his life. He really wanted to capture America living a wonderful life and reflect that back to the people of the nation.
I can remember looking at those covers, and you know, when you talk about Rockwell's obsession with kids, it's really about a kind of historical idea about democracy, which is that democracy is always about the promise of its youth. You know, in Rockwell's pictures, that was the culture was about being okay to the kids. Rockwell always issues permissions. Indignities and improprieties are always forgiven. Picture the runaway with his little bindle. He's been collected by the policeman and buys him a soda fountain, so he's sitting there with the nice policeman. He forgives kids for messing around with, I think, with the implicit presumption that they're going to still mess around when they're grown up.
Rockwell dealt with all extremes. He dealt with kids, he dealt with loneliness. That wonderful picture of the little girl just staring at herself in the mirror, sitting like this with her knees together. He dealt with every touchstone in life, and he would make a meal out of it.
Norman Rockwell was a storyteller. I mean, if he was anything, he was a storyteller. And always full of details so that you could reinforce the story. If you think of something like the Rembrandt, the great Rembrandt of the Prodigal Son in Russia, you know, the father with his hands on the young man's shoulders, and these two hands tell the whole story. And when Norman deals with a comparable subject, the separation of the father and son, when the father is sitting there with his son's going off to college, it's not like that, but it's so specific. You know everything about the father. You know, he's a farmer. The top of his head has been shielded by a big hat, so he's lighter up here than he is down here.
You look at the son's awkward brand new clothes, and you notice a red flag that they're going to have to use to stop the train to send the son away. It's only when you collectively look at all those details that what seems to be a kind of perky picture becomes terribly sad. You have to stop this life, and that boy has to go away from his father, and his father is going to feel terrible for a long time. And you could cry. I don't think that particularly his critics have looked hard enough at these works, which always reward looking hard.
I think it's wonderful how he actually, used source light without creating too much of a contrast between the source and the subject. So I thought that was real brave for an American illustrator who wasn't just willing to front light everything.
He had some of the qualities of, well, in certain paintings, like Vermeer practically, like the barber shop, where you look into this darkened space and there at the back, illuminated, some kind of music is being played.
The transparency of the window seems to invite us to readily move inside, behind the picture plane where old men are playing music at night. And you can almost hear them in the stillness of this picture.
Norman was never complacent, in my experience. He was never self-satisfied. He used to show me work he had done and point out what was wrong with it. He'd say, oh, every time I see this thing, I wish I had done so-and-so. I remember one of the case in points was a family going to church on Sunday morning, but the family is a kind of a caricature of a family. I mean, they've got funny noses and they're walking in a funny kind of Disney-esque sort of way. And yet the background of these houses is a beautiful piece of landscape painting. And he bemoaned the fact that he had treated the family in this way. He wished he'd treated them with the seriousness that the rest of this cover had.
One of the charges we're always hit with is that we're very much like Norman Rockwell. And, you know, I don't take that as such a bad charge, although the critics love to throw that. I think a lot of his work is very sweet, very kind of almost Disney-fied, which I think puts off a lot of serious students of art. But I think if you see beyond that, there is a remarkable intensity that he brought to American life that, you know, nobody else has done.
When you look at Rockwell's, I mean, the thing that I've always found so interesting about them is that when he's doing ideas, he's really awful, I think. In other words, when he's doing like freedom from want, you know, when he's doing sort of concepts, when he's doing really historical moments, and that's why, you know, as I call Rockwell a democratic history painting, even though they're domestic scenes, they're historical moments. He's talking about how history happens right down here on the street. Everybody's always engaged in something to do with the daily life of the Republic.
There's a fabulous picture of 1949, which is one of the watershed moments in American history. It shows a man installing TV antennae on his roof. But the roof that he's putting it on is a gable of a Victorian house, so it just quietly suggests the contrast between old and new.
And then you notice that it occupies the same position as the church steeples do in the landscape in the background. So is this the beginning of a new religion?
It's the transformation from BC to AD, before television, to after television, and it just soars forward to the world we live in.
The picture that most characterizes Rockwell's view of history is this picture, I think it's called Moving Day or something, in which a giant moving van is trying to make its way down a little teeny alley, and people are hanging out the windows and stuff. I mean, for Rockwell, it's just always this kind of tumult of things changing, and people are looking and people are talking, and all this stuff is going on. And to me, that's what Rockwell is about. It's just a specific moment of historical transition.
For Rockwell himself, the early 50s marked the end of his time in Arlington. Despite the peace and stability he had found there, the years had not been so easy for his wife, Mary.
My mother was an extremely warm person. She took on herself the extremely difficult job of, 1 year out of college, and she marries somebody who has for 14 years been a well-known artist, and takes on the job of doing all the work for him, bringing up the kids, doing the taxes, taking care of the house, everything. My father was earning, by the mid-40s, early 50s, a lot of money, but my mother was still expected to do the taxes. And it took her having a nervous breakdown for him to realize you could hire a tax accountant.
I know that Mary was very troubled. She was an extremely intelligent person. And maybe she wanted her own identity. That's the way we all discussed it among ourselves.
It created tensions in the family. Created a lot of tensions over the fact that I think my father felt that the public image ought to be something like his painting, and it wasn't. Eventually she cracked under the pressure of all this and became an alcoholic, and then had nervous breakdowns, and I think tried to commit suicide and had to be off and on committed to mental institutions. And in fact, the reason we moved to Stockbridge was because there was the very good Riggs Foundation, which is a psychiatric mental institution, and she just needed to be near it.
Rockwell was already 59 years old when he moved his family to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Yet it became the town with which he is most identified.
It presented still this fantasy of a very clean and very white Americana in which family values were preserved. It also was based in some part on fantasies about colonial America. There was that sense of purity. Everybody was prim. They lived in little white painted houses, and there was absolutely no social unrest.
Norman, Stockbridge appears to be a most pleasant town, and I know that personally from driving through it.
Yes, Ed, we're here and welcome to Stockbridge.
Thank you. Do all the Rockwells share your affection for Stockbridge?
Oh, yes. They're here, and I'd like very much to have you meet them.
Thank you.
This is Mary, my wife.
Good evening, Mrs. Rockwell.
This is Mary.
Good evening, Mr. Merle.
Mrs. Rockwell, with Norman doing all his work at home, does he bother you or do you bother him?
Neither of us bothers the other.
The usual biographic statement about Rockwell is that he moves to Stockbridge for the sake of his second wife, who entered treatment there for alcoholism. But in fact, Rockwell was ridden throughout his life by depressive episodes that he only began treating in earnest when they moved to Stockbridge.
Rockwell made friends outside the art world. One was Eric Erickson, a famous psychologist connected to the Austin Riggs Center.
They met every Tuesday at the Red Lion and had lunch and just had a good time. Erickson was sort of a spiritual support. He was helpful to Rockwell when he felt under pressure, and they also had a friendship. I think he also sort of took care of the whole family in a way. He was sort of a family doctor.
Norman had a long-term relationship with Riggs. And he used to pay for some of the fees with charcoal portraits of the various doctors, Eric among them. There was no outward sign of any mental upset. There were certainly mood swings, possibly some manic, possibly some depression, I don't know.
The question that Norman Rockwell kept asking himself, well, was he merely an illustrator or was he a genuine artist? And I think he always yearned to be an artist with a capital A, the kind that went into the museums, as opposed to covers of magazines like the Saturday Evening Post.
He decided that my brothers should learn to be artists. I remember my father distinctly saying at one point, I want you guys to be serious artists, not a commercial artist like me. I want you to be the real thing.
He never called himself an artist. He always called himself an illustrator. He refused to be called an artist.
I feel that the kind of thing I like to do, I know it isn't the highest form of art. I love to tell stories and pictures. I say, well, do people laugh or do they cry when they see it? Now, that isn't what a fine art man goes for, but I go for it.
Apparently his approach at that early point was popular, so he kept getting commission to do more and more. He got sick of it at some point. And one day he said to me, he said, gee, if I could start all over again, I would paint like Picasso. He was bored or frustrated. Like one day he slammed the door, which was unlike him, and said, what's the matter? I said, 35 years of Boy Scout calendars, I've had it. So I said, why don't you stop? I mean, you don't need the money anymore. So, no, I can't. You know, he was sort of into this so much he really couldn't stop.
At the peak of his success, Rockwell played to his public image at every opportunity.
It's an interesting custom, the way they decorate you when you come to Hawaii. They don't even ask whether you have allergies or not.
He traveled the world in a promotion for Pan Am, and he lent his name to a correspondence course, the famous Artist School.
The idea of the famous Artist School was that you could have a mail-order art school. And of course, the use of his name was absolutely key to the success of that whole project. It was, in a sense, misleading, let me say, to some of us, because it did imply that Norman Rockwell was going to pay attention to you, and in fact, of course, there was no way he was going to pay attention to you.
I have a set of books myself of the courses. I never took the course, but I wish I had. I'd be a better artist.
He became a marketable quantity, so to speak, over and above his work. He became a kind of a living monument to himself in his own time. And I think he rather enjoyed that. He was very modest about it, but I think he enjoyed it.
Tony, I'm told that you're the writing member of the family. Is that right?
Yes, Mr. Murrow, I want to be a writer. Right now, I'm helping Pop with his autobiography. It's going to be a long one because he's 65 and...
Oh, you have to tell.
He liked his self-image, and he liked being famous. And the pipe, remember, was very much part of his self-image. I mean, I can remember sometime in the 50s going to a play in New York on Broadway, and I became conscious, as he did, that there were sort of a few people over there who suddenly recognized him, and he suddenly pulled out his pipe and put it in his mouth to make it clear who he was. And his public persona of being the folksy, nice, everyday person was in some conflict with the intensity of the perfectionist and workaholic and lover of great painting.
I'm going to kind of put you on the spot. I'm going to ask you, who is your favorite artist?
Well, of all time, there's no doubt, Rembrandt. You know, I mean, he was the greatest guy. I mean, to me, a Rembrandt painting, any of his paintings, they're like a beautiful symphony. I mean, they have these great deep notes. He understood humanity, and he's just the greatest.
He just adored Rembrandt. I remember one of my first memories of a museum was something like 1946. There was a show at the Metropolitan, and I remember my intense embarrassment because he got up so close to the Rembrandt, so intensely, pointing at the guard, told him to get away. He had this funny way of putting pictures in a picture and then making the picture more alive than the people in the picture. Just the intensity of his love of the art of painting, I think, fed things into his painting which wouldn't have been there otherwise. One of the ones that is both most obvious and most fun is the Rosie the Riveter, in which the pose is a direct take from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling.
One of the interesting blurs in the boundaries between Rockwell and the presumably high art of the museums is in a self-portrait he did. Tacked up all around the canvas are self-portraits by the old masters.
He puts up a Rembrandt, a Dürer, a Picasso, and a Van Gogh. These are all the great people of painting. He is putting himself in relationship to them. For once in his life, he's saying, these are the people I compare myself with.
One of the things that strikes me about that picture is that somehow it's not about him, it's about an image of him. You know, he had a wonderful face, a very expressive face. And the face in that triple self-portrait, there's no face there at all. It's just a banality. It's completely devoid of the rubber mask that was his face.
You never see his eyes. In that image, the glasses have the light hitting him so you don't see his eyes. So the only place you see his eyes is where he has drawn them in for you. He's saying, I'm different from what you think I am.
Norman Rockwell, for me and for lots of people of my generation, was just completely out of bounds. I mean, it was almost a dirty word in terms of the history of art.
He really came a cropper during the 1950s when the abstract expressionists were in ascendancy in the New York art market, and when showing one's emotion and one's bodily movements visibly on canvas was what you were supposed to do as a painter.
It's quite apparent that he was in touch with the history of modern art. There is a famous Norman Rockwell in which he reproduces a painting by Jackson Pollock. Well, he doesn't exactly reproduce it. He invents his own Jackson Pollock.
He couldn't have painted it the way Pollock did, using the whole arm. I mean, this is a wrist painting, notwithstanding. It's very, very convincing. I guess Rockwell had to take on the greatest living American artist by being the greatest living American artist at that point himself. And so there's a little bit of a conflict.
He tried to do something more free. His second wife, she was not a professional artist, but she painted a lot, and she was totally free and uninhibited and could just sit down and whip out a portrait, not a realistic portrait, just, and he was very envious. He said, God, I wished I could do like Mary, just sit down and paint. But he knew he couldn't do it.
In 1959, Mary Rockwell died unexpectedly of a heart attack. The children were grown, and Rockwell was left on his own.
About a year after my mother died, out of some sense of either boredom or whatever, my father started taking a poetry course with this cute Molly Punderson, who at 65 had just retired from being English teacher for 35 years at Milton Academy. And I remember spending the latter part of the summer with Cindy, my wife, saying, look, Dad, come on, ask her to marry you, for goodness sake. Don't be frightened. You're in love with her. She's obviously interested in you. And so then he married his third wife.
Oh, I think she changed him dramatically. An old friend of his made the remark that, thank goodness, Molly made him a liberal. And because I don't know if he had any particular political affiliations before, but Molly came in and really, he did become a liberal.
She did change him because he would never do paintings of social issues which might make anybody annoyed before that. He always said, I will not disturb my audience. And she had a very strong social conscience, and the painting, The Problem We All Live With, was probably done because Molly made it clear to him that he should be doing this sort of thing.
His famous segregation painting, I think, is a profound work and one of his greatest paintings, where his own point of view, like his sort of sweet flavoring of America, was suddenly tempered by what existed in the real world, and he decided to start painting about that.
The painting was based on the true story of Ruby Bridges, the 6-year-old girl who integrated a New Orleans school in 1960.
We hardly ever, until the 1960s, see black people in Norman Rockwell's work. And we might be able to account for the latter by the fact that the Saturday Evening Post made that part of their editorial policy. They actually told Norman Rockwell that they didn't want him to use black people on his covers unless they were in a subservient position.
I asked Rockwell why there were never blacks in his painting, and he said because editors don't want it. He had worked for years for an editor named Ben Hibbs at the Saturday Evening Post, and the standing order was don't put black people in your paintings. It makes people feel uneasy.
Rockwell cracked through these boundaries of what Americans like to see reflected about themselves. And in the 1960s especially, he did pictures of civil rights activists in the South who had been shot or injured. And these are appallingly true documents that suddenly speak about the ugly facts of America as opposed to the whitewashed candy box images that he had painted before. It's quite an extraordinary conversion.
There was a side of him that was quite different than I expected. His banter was about things like what a jerk he thought Richard Nixon was, how there was nothing good to find in the Vietnam War, why were we doing this? He said that when he painted the Four Freedoms during World War II, he believed everything in that painting. And he said, I could not do that painting again because I thought all those things were going to prevail after the war. And then other things happened. And he said, I feel sad about that. And I think the reason he felt sad about it was he wanted it to be. I mean, if we believed a myth, if he engendered a myth in the populace, I think to a large extent through most of his life, he believed it more than we did.
Let me say first that I accept the nomination of the...
By the 1960s, Rockwell was painting for a different audience and new clients. Many of his illustrations during this period were commissioned by Look magazine.
Norman Rockwell didn't ever really decline popularity, but the main machine that carried him did. The Saturday Evening Post became less and less interesting to people. Life magazine took over, Look magazine took over. These were both magazines about the events of the day, and they were full of all sorts of stuff that people had to face, whether they wanted to or not. And in that process, Norman lost his major market. He went on and he did a lot of other new things. You know, he worked for NASA. He got very much involved with presidential portraits and what these presidential faces represented to us as images of who we were and that kind of thing. So he shifted and he tried to find new markets, and he was so preeminent in his field as an illustrator that he was still much sought after.
Norman Rockwell, Dean of American Artists.
You know, I'm a stickler for true-to-life color. That's the reason I took my time in picking my first color TV. I'd like to show it to you. And here it is, my new Zenith Color TV.
Win a Norman Rockwell portrait of you and your cat in the Purina Cat Food $100,000 double sweepstakes.
Late in his career, he was pretty much a paparazzo. He abandoned the club of, oh, I'm just Norman Rockwell going around collecting old uniforms and painting pictures of ordinary Americans. All of a sudden, he's flying around the world looking at Peace Corps projects, hanging out in Hollywood. He just moved into this new celebrity culture. He's not painting kids no swimming, he's painting Jack Kennedy, he's painting astronauts, he's painting Peace Corps workers. He's dealing with at a level of generalization that he has never dealt with before, and he's also dealing with ideas. He's not dealing with narratives.
Here's the thing here that I did. Just happened to have my violin with me.
Yeah, it just happened.
Well, I mean, here, these are supposed to be, see, this is the golden rule. But now here are all different race, creeds, and color. I just want to personify that people are, what they are reflected in their faces, and they represent the peoples of the earth, and if we could only all get together, everything would be hunky-dory. Yeah.
Rockwell thought that by illustrating these big issues, he was somehow establishing himself as a major painter. He was already a major painter. I mean, he mistook the idea of great art and high art. They're not the same thing. He wanted to paint high art, which means that it's abstracted, that it's about ideas. In a sense, in his own primitive way, Rockwell's late oeuvre is all conceptual. You know, it's an illustration of the golden rule. You know, it's got text on it, just like conceptual art has.
Although he would never mostly admit it, he really did want the admiration of the fine arts world. He really did feel that he was good. He once told me that he had just been in Amsterdam, and he said, I got the curator of the Rembrandt Museum to let me go into Rembrandt's studio at sunset, and I went in and I said, Rembrandt, I'm Norman Rockwell, and what do you think of me? And he stopped and he said, and I didn't get an answer.
Rockwell may have felt that the avuncular pipe-smoking painter was a trap, particularly when he was passed over for the conventional art world honors. On the other hand, it must have been a tremendously reassuring thing to have been. He was greatly honored at the end of his life. Presidents and nabobs of all sorts visited him. The town of Stockbridge had a parade in his honor. He made a fabulous living at this, too, until the very end of his life. So it must be kind of like being a movie star in a way. Oh, I can't stand it. Oh, the pressures of this terrible life. On the other hand, there are all the wonderful things that go with it.
He was a pro, you know. He was a guy that did what he did better than anybody else and was paid more than anybody else for it. He also was a very kind man and a very generous man. I don't know that I ever heard anything mean said about Norman Rockwell by anybody who knew him.
In his late paintings, Rockwell continued to explore the story of America, its past and future. His final work, John Sargent and Chief Concopat, was left unfinished on his easel. On November 8, 1978, Rockwell died in Stockbridge at the age of 84.
I do remember the last time I saw Norman, it was in Stockbridge. I came up to visit. I think he had been ill. He had one stroke. And Molly, his third wife, said to me, oh, you go, he'll love to see you. But don't be surprised if he doesn't remember you. And I said, okay. I said, I just want to say hello, because we were passing through. And he came out on his two canes, and he saw me, and his two canes went like that, and he threw his arms around me. He said, oh, Lee. And in fact, I'm going to start crying. And I said, well, I didn't know whether you'd remember me or not. And he said, I would always remember you.
Over the years, I have thought many, many times about what was this connection that I had with Norman Rockwell. It obviously was a big event in my life. From what I can gather at the time, it was just part of my everyday. It didn't seem to impact me. But as I got older and began to reflect, I became aware that Norman really affirmed me and really accepted me who I was, where I was. And he challenged me. He brought me into his whole creation. I seemed to be a part of that. That was a great gift to me.
Before he died, Rockwell had thought about the future of his paintings and laid the groundwork to provide a home for them in Stockbridge. Many of his originals now hang in the Norman Rockwell Museum, just about a mile from Main Street.
That's where that lion
No,
where we
he would sit in
I'm from a small New England town, so in a way, coming here is in a sense kind of like coming home.
He means a lot to me. Being an educator and coming from a different country, he's so down to earth. It means a lot to a family like my family.
He means the average American, what we used to think of when I was growing up as the people being.
Well, I thought it was important for him to have his own museum because I thought it was important for America to have its own museum. And I really, think that is the American museum that certainly represents the ideals, the high ideals, of this nation. And a lot of that museum reflects the history of our nation through Rockwell's eyes.
If we lose what Rockwell and Rockwell's art stood for, then we have lost something very basic to what it means to be an American. I don't want to raise the flag and all that, but I think that's true. So when all those black-suited, black-dressed, chic people mock Rockwell, then you take them aside and you walk them through. It's interesting, they get it. They drop the Armani shield and they look and they rediscover that this is part of our culture.
Well, now that modernism has just about croaked, we are perhaps able to take a more relaxed view of the history of art. And if we do, Rockwell will be right in there on the cutting edge of what American art is all about, it seems to me. He just sort of got trapped, I think, as a Hallmark card somewhere along the line.
For the time being, Rockwell, of course, has his own shrine, his own sanctuary in the museum in Stockbridge. But my hunch is that in 20 or 30 years, he will have left his sanctuary and left his low stratum of popular illustration and be absorbed into the history of 20th century art.
We find a way to keep the things we love. And when things go out of fashion, we find a way to keep the things we love. Rockwell went out of fashion. He didn't go into the museum, but he's still here. He doesn't need to be in a museum.
Norman Rockwell is like the ideal idea of what America should be, or what we'd like it to be, and we never quite have any Norman Rockwell moments.
Somebody's defined art as a lie which helps us to perceive the truth. And I think in a way Rockwell fitted that definition. He did tell us a lie about America, but it helps us to perceive a deep truth about ourselves.
Support for American Masters is made possible in part by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television, and by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts. Additional funding for American Masters is provided by Rosalind P. Walter, Jack Rudin, the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation, the Andre and Elizabeth Cortez Foundation, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. A presentation of WNET, New York.
This is PBS.